The phone buzzed once on the kitchen counter, and Vanessa Cole almost let it go. It was past midnight, and she had told herself she would not check it again. But something about the silence in the house, the empty side of the bed, the untouched dinner plate still sitting in the fridge, made her fingers move before her mind agreed. She was not looking for anything. She told herself that even as she picked it up. She was only checking the time, only checking if Daniel had texted to say he was on his way home from his so-called work dinner. What she saw instead was a call already connected, already running, the screen glowing with a name she did not expect to see lit up at this hour. Elena. She had not dialed it, she was sure of that. The call must have started by accident, a pocket dial, a brush of fabric against glass. She almost hung up. Her thumb hovered over the red button. But then she heard his voice, low and warm in a way she had not heard directed at her in a long time, and something in her chest went cold and still. "I regret marrying her," Daniel said. "I think I only did it because it was expected of me." Vanessa did not breathe. She stood barefoot on the kitchen tile, the phone pressed so hard against her ear that it hurt, and she listened to her husband of 9 years describe their marriage as a mistake, a trap, a life he had wandered into without ever choosing it. She listened to him tell another woman that he felt free with her in a way he had never felt with his own wife. She listened to him laugh, softly, at something Elena said back, a laugh she used to think belonged only to her. She did not cry, she did not speak. She simply listened, every word landing like a stone dropped into still water, until the call ended on its own and the kitchen went silent again. Vanessa set the phone down carefully, as if it might shatter, and looked around the room she had built with her own hands over the better part of a decade. The curtains she had sewn herself in their first apartment. The photographs on the wall, chosen and arranged one weekend when Daniel was away on a business trip. The high chair pushed into the corner, waiting for their youngest to outgrow the need for it. All of it suddenly looked like a stage set for a life that had already ended without her knowledge. She thought about waking her children, Lily and Noah, and holding them until the ache in her chest went away. She thought about calling her sister, Olivia, who had warned her 2 years ago that something felt different about Daniel, that his eyes did not meet hers the same way anymore. She thought about screaming into a pillow until her throat gave out. Instead, she did something else entirely. She walked upstairs, quiet as a shadow, and began to fold their children's clothes into a suitcase. It was not a decision made in a single moment of fury. It was a decision that had been building for months, maybe longer, in the small silences Daniel left behind him, in the late nights he explained away too quickly, in the way he had stopped reaching for her hand in the car. Vanessa had noticed all of it. She had simply chosen, until tonight, to believe that noticing was not the same as knowing. Now she knew. By 2 in the morning, the suitcases were packed and lined up by the front door like soldiers waiting for orders. Vanessa sat on the bottom stair in the dark, phone in her lap, scrolling through years of photographs she had taken of her family. Birthdays, beach trips. The day they moved into this house, Daniel spinning her around the empty living room while Lily, only 3 at the time, clapped her small hands and shrieked with laughter. She stared at his smiling face in every picture and tried to reconcile it with the voice she had heard less than 2 hours earlier, and she could not. She thought about waking him when he finally came home, about throwing the truth in his face and demanding an explanation. Some tired, wounded part of her wanted that confrontation, wanted to watch the color drain from his face when he realized she knew everything. But a colder, steadier part of her, a part she had not known existed until tonight, told her that confrontation was a gift she no longer owed him. He did not deserve the courtesy of her anger. He deserved silence, the same silence he had shown her by keeping this secret for however long it had been running underneath their life like a slow leak in a foundation. She heard his car pull into the driveway a little after 3. She heard the front door open softly, his footsteps trying not to wake her, the particular quiet of a man who thought he had gotten away with something. She sat perfectly still on the stairs in the dark and listened to him climb toward the bedroom, humming faintly under his breath, a man untouched by guilt because he believed no one had ever heard him. Vanessa did not go to him that night. She waited until she heard the bedroom door close, until the house fell into the low, even breathing of a man sleeping soundly beside a life he thought was still intact. Only then did she allow herself to cry, silently, into her own hands, at the bottom of the staircase, in the house she had once believed was forever. By sunrise she had a plan. She woke the children gently, telling them only that they were going on a small trip to see their grandmother, a story simple enough for Lily's 7-year-old mind to accept without question and vague enough that Noah, barely 5, would not think to mention it later. She packed a bag for herself with quiet, mechanical efficiency, taking only what mattered: her passport. A folder of documents she had quietly gathered over the past year without fully understanding why: bank statements, the deed to a small property her grandmother had left her, records Daniel did not know she still had access to, and one photograph, a single one, of her parents on their wedding day, tucked into the side pocket of her bag like a talisman. Daniel was still asleep when she loaded the car. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a long moment, watching him breathe, searching her own heart for some final flicker of the love that had once made her certain this man was the only person she would ever choose. She found none. What she found instead was a strange, clean kind of grief, the grief of watching something die that had already been dead for longer than she wanted to admit. She did not leave a note. She had considered it in the small hours of the night, composing 100 different versions in her head, some cruel, some heartbroken, some simply factual. In the end, she decided that silence was the only message worth sending. He had spoken the truth to another woman in the dark, believing no one but Alina could hear him. Now he would understand what it felt like to be met with nothing at all, no explanation, no warning, only an empty house and the sound of his own words echoing back at him with no one left to answer them. She backed the car out of the driveway just as the sun broke fully over the houses across the street, the same street where she had once imagined growing old, where she had pictured her children learning to ride bicycles, and where she had believed, foolishly, that nothing could ever truly go wrong as long as she kept trying hard enough. In the back seat, Lily pressed her face against the window and asked where they were really going. Vanessa met her daughter's eyes in the rearview mirror and managed a small, steady smile, the kind of smile mothers learn to produce even when their whole world has quietly come apart in the middle of the night. Somewhere new, she said, somewhere better. She did not yet know if that was true, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would make it true, one way or another, even if it meant rebuilding everything from nothing. Behind her, the house grew smaller in the mirror, and with it, the life she had spent 9 years constructing around a man who had never truly chosen her at all. Daniel woke just after 9 that morning, to an unusual quiet. No small feet running down the hallway. No cartoons playing faintly from the living room television. No smell of coffee drifting up the stairs, since Vanessa always made a pot before the children woke, an old habit from their earliest days together that she had never abandoned even on her most exhausted mornings. He lay in bed for a moment, enjoying what he assumed was a rare late morning, some quiet gift of a slow Saturday. It was only when he reached for his phone and saw the time, saw that it was already midweek and not the weekend at all, that a faint unease began to stir somewhere beneath his contentment. He called out for Vanessa, no answer. He called for Lily, for Noah. The silence that met him felt suddenly heavier than ordinary quiet, felt deliberate in a way he could not yet explain to himself. He walked downstairs in his bare feet, the tile cold beneath him, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at the empty high chair, the untouched coffee maker, the strange stillness of a house that should have been full of small noise at this hour. It was the missing photograph on the hallway table that finally cracked his calm. The frame was still there, sitting exactly where it always sat, but the picture inside it, the one of Vanessa's parents on their wedding day, was gone, the glass covering nothing but empty cardboard backing. Daniel stood very still in the hallway, a strange cold feeling beginning to climb up through his chest, though he could not yet name what it was he was afraid of. He told himself there had to be a simple explanation. A family emergency. An early errand. Some ordinary reason a wife might leave the house before her husband woke, taking her children and a single photograph with her, saying nothing at all. He did not yet know that somewhere on a quiet highway 2 hours away, Vanessa was driving steadily toward a future he had no part in, her children asleep in the back seat, her hands calm on the wheel, her heart finally, terribly clear about what she intended to do next. He picked up his phone and called her number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail, her familiar voice asking him to leave a message after the tone, a voice that had greeted him 1,000 mornings before this one, and had never once failed to answer when he truly needed her. He would call 6 more times before noon. Every single one would go unanswered, and with each unanswered ring, the cold feeling in his chest would grow a little colder, a little more certain, though certain of what, he still could not say. He had no idea, standing there in his empty kitchen with a silent phone in his hand, that the answer to every unanswered call was already written in words he himself had spoken the night before, in a conversation he believed no one but Alina had ever heard. Alina Brooks did not consider herself a woman who broke families apart. She had told herself this so many times over the past year that it had become a kind of quiet religion, a belief she returned to whenever doubt crept in at the edges of her mind. She had not gone looking for Daniel Cole. He had come to her, slowly, carefully, the way water finds its way through the smallest crack in a wall, until one day the wall was simply gone, and neither of them remembered exactly when it had happened. They met at a charity gala 18 months earlier, in a hotel ballroom filled with the kind of polite, glittering conversation that Alina had learned to move through with practiced ease. She was there to photograph the event for a local magazine, camera slung over one shoulder, dressed simply compared to the sequined gowns around her. And it was that simplicity, she would later learn, that had first caught Daniel's attention across the room. He approached her near the dessert table, complimenting her camera rather than her appearance, asking thoughtful questions about her work instead of offering empty flattery. Alina, who had grown tired of men who only saw her as decoration, found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation. He was funny in a dry, understated way. He listened when she spoke, really listened, nodding at the right moments, asking follow-up questions that showed he had actually absorbed what she said rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. He mentioned his wife only once that first night, briefly, almost as an afterthought, describing her as busy with the children and rarely able to attend these kinds of events. Alina had not thought much of it at the time. Married men attended galas alone all the time. It meant nothing, she told herself. It was simply a fact, stated plainly, nothing more. They exchanged numbers under the pretense of future collaboration, Daniel mentioning that his firm was always looking for a skilled photographer for their architectural projects, their office openings, their award ceremonies. It was a reasonable, professional excuse, and for the first few weeks that was exactly what it remained. Text messages about scheduling, emails about lighting and angles, nothing more. The shift happened gradually, the way most dangerous things do. A late-night text that started as a work question and drifted into personal territory. A coffee meeting that ran 2 hours longer than either of them expected. A moment, 3 months in, when Daniel admitted quietly that he had not felt this easy with another person in years. And Alina, against every instinct that told her to step back, felt something in her chest respond to that honesty like a plant leaning toward sunlight. She was 31 years old, recently out of a long relationship that had ended not in dramatic betrayal, but in slow, exhausting indifference. She had sworn to herself after that breakup that she would not settle for half attention again, that the next person who wanted her would have to want her fully, without hesitation, without excuses. And here was Daniel, married, complicated, offering her exactly the kind of full, focused attention she had been starving for, wrapped inside a situation she knew, somewhere beneath her growing feelings, that she should never have allowed to begin. She asked him directly early on about his marriage. She remembered the conversation clearly, sitting across from him in a small cafe near her studio, rain streaking the windows behind him. She asked if he was happy. He had paused for a long moment before answering, longer than felt comfortable, and then said that he and Vanessa had become more like business partners running a household than two people in love. He said the passion had faded years ago, buried under mortgage payments and school schedules, and the thousand small logistics of raising 2 children. He said he sometimes felt invisible in his own home, unseen, unheard, reduced to a function rather than a person. Alina believed him. She had no reason not to. Men did not typically speak with that particular kind of quiet weariness unless something was genuinely wrong. And so, slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to fall, telling herself all the while that she was not the villain in this story, that she was simply a woman who had found real connection with a man whose marriage was already over in every way that mattered except the legal paperwork. The affair, when it finally became physical, felt to Alina less like a betrayal and more like an inevitability, the natural conclusion of months of growing closeness that neither of them had the strength or the desire to stop. She remembered the first night clearly, the mixture of guilt and undeniable relief that came with finally acknowledging out loud what had been building silently between them for so long. Daniel had held her afterward and told her that being with her felt like breathing after holding his breath for years. She had wanted, more than anything, to believe that was true. Over the following months, their relationship deepened in ways that surprised even Alina. It was not simply physical. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, about her photography projects and his frustration with the direction of his firm, about childhood memories and half-formed dreams neither of them had ever spoken aloud to anyone else. Daniel began confiding in her the way people confide in someone they trust completely, telling her about his fears, his regrets, his growing sense that he had built a life around other people's expectations rather than his own genuine desires. He told her more than once that Vanessa had changed after they married, that the woman he had fallen in love with had somehow disappeared into schedules and responsibilities, and a kind of practical seriousness that left no room for spontaneity or joy. Alina, who had never met Vanessa, who knew her only through Daniel's careful, one-sided descriptions, began to form a picture in her mind of a cold, distant woman, someone who had let the marriage grow stale through neglect and inattention. It did not occur to Alina, not seriously, not for a long time, that she was hearing only one side of a much more complicated story. There were moments of doubt, of course. Alina was not a woman without conscience, and there were nights she lay awake wondering what kind of person she had become, wondering about the children she had never met but knew existed, a daughter and a son whose photographs she had glimpsed once on Daniel's phone before he quickly changed the subject. She wondered whether they sensed anything was wrong in their home, whether some instinctive part of them already understood that their father's heart had wandered elsewhere. She raised these doubts with Daniel occasionally, tentatively, watching his face for any sign of hesitation, any sign that he too questioned the path they were on. He always had an answer ready, smooth and reassuring, telling her that he was planning to leave, that he simply needed the right time, that he did not want to upend his children's lives without careful preparation, that leaving a marriage was more complicated than simply walking out the door. Alina, wanting badly to believe him, always accepted these explanations, filing away her doubts for another day that never quite seemed to arrive. Their relationship existed almost entirely in stolen hours, late lunches that stretched into afternoons, evenings when Daniel claimed to be working late at the office. Occasional weekend trips explained away as business conferences, during which Alina and Daniel would spend 2 or 3 days in a hotel far enough from home that no one would recognize them, living briefly inside a fantasy of what their life together might look like if the world were simpler than it actually was. It was during one of these trips, 6 weeks before the night Vanessa overheard everything, that Alina first asked Daniel directly what he intended to do about his marriage. They were sitting on a hotel balcony overlooking a quiet coastal town, wine glasses sweating in the evening heat, and Alina, emboldened by the wine and the growing ache of wanting more than stolen hours, finally said the words she had been holding back for months. "I need to know if this is going somewhere," she told him. "I can't keep living like this, loving someone I only get to see in pieces." Daniel had reached for her hand across the small table, his expression serious in a way that made her chest tighten with hope. He told her that he loved her, that he had never expected to feel this way about anyone again, that he was simply waiting for the right moment to tell Vanessa the truth. He promised her that by the end of the year, everything would be different. He promised her a real life together, out in the open, without secrecy, without stolen hours and hurried goodbyes. Alina wanted, desperately, to believe him. And so, despite every quiet warning bell ringing somewhere in the back of her mind, she chose to trust him, to keep waiting, to keep loving a man who came to her every time smelling faintly of another woman's home, wearing a wedding ring he never once offered to remove. What Alina did not yet know, what she could not have known sitting on that balcony convincing herself that patience would be rewarded, was that her own quiet doubts about Daniel's honesty were about to be answered in a way far more brutal than she ever could have imagined, and that the woman she had spent a year picturing as cold and distant was, in fact, about to prove herself far stronger and far more decisive than either Daniel or Alina had ever given her credit for. The night of the accidental phone call began like so many others before it. Daniel had told Vanessa he was attending a late dinner with a client, a lie so practiced by now that it slipped from him without effort, without even a flicker of guilt crossing his face. He met Alina instead at her apartment, a small, sunlit space filled with photographs she had taken over the years, prints hanging on nearly every wall, a visual record of a life lived with far more openness and honesty than the one Daniel had built for himself. They had dinner together, simple pasta Alina had made herself, and afterward they sat curled together on her small couch, her head resting against his chest, his fingers absently tracing patterns along her arm. It was in this quiet, unguarded moment, wrapped in the particular kind of comfort that comes from feeling completely at ease with another person, that Daniel began speaking more freely than he perhaps intended. He talked about his frustration with a recent project at work, about a disagreement with his business partner, about the slow accumulating weight of responsibilities that seemed to multiply endlessly the older he got. And then, almost without transition, he began talking about Vanessa, about the early days of their marriage when everything had felt lighter, easier, before children and mortgages, and the thousand small compromises of shared life had settled over them like dust. "Sometimes I think about what my life would look like if I had made different choices," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper in the dim apartment. "I regret marrying her. I think I only did it because it was expected of me." Alina, listening with her eyes closed, felt a familiar mixture of guilt and validation move through her chest. Part of her wanted to comfort him, to tell him that regret was a natural feeling, that it did not make him a bad person. Another part of her, quieter, more honest, felt a small flicker of unease at how easily the words had come, how casually he had spoken about the woman who was, after all, still his wife, still the mother of his children, still asleep at that very moment in the home they shared, entirely unaware that her marriage was being dissected and dismissed in a stranger's living room. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet, intimate moment, that Daniel's phone, resting in the pocket of his coat draped over the arm of the couch, had somehow connected a call to a contact he had not intended to dial. Neither of them heard the faint click of the connection, the almost imperceptible change in the ambient sound of the room as another line opened somewhere far away. They continued talking, continued sharing the kind of unguarded honesty that exists only between people who believe themselves to be completely alone, entirely unaware that every word was traveling, at that exact moment, into the ear of the one person in the world it was never meant to reach. It was only much later, after Daniel had finally driven home in the dark, humming to himself, congratulating himself silently on another evening successfully navigated without detection, that the true consequences of that accidental call would begin to reveal themselves. And by then, it would already be far too late for apologies, for explanations, for any of the careful, practiced excuses that had served him so well for so long. Vanessa drove for nearly 3 hours before she finally stopped, pulling into the gravel driveway of a small guest house just outside a quiet coastal town she had visited once, years ago, before children, before mortgages, before she had learned to measure her own happiness against the shifting moods of a husband who no longer looked at her the way he once had. The owner, a kind, older woman named Margaret, did not ask questions when Vanessa requested a room for an open-ended stay, only smiled gently and handed over a key, as though she had seen this particular kind of tired, determined woman many times before. The children adjusted faster than Vanessa expected. Lily, 7 and endlessly curious, was delighted by the guest house's small garden and the chickens that wandered freely behind it. Noah, still young enough to find comfort simply in his mother's presence, seemed content as long as she remained nearby. Vanessa watched them play in the garden that first afternoon, sunlight catching their hair, and felt something in her chest crack open with a grief so large she had to turn away and press her palm against the cool stone wall of the house to keep herself upright. She had not cried in front of them. She would not allow herself that. Whatever she was feeling, whatever storm was moving through her, she owed her children a version of herself that remained steady, present, capable of making them feel safe even as their entire world quietly rearranged itself around them. She had learned this from her own mother, a woman who had weathered her own share of disappointments without ever once letting her children see her falter, and Vanessa found herself grateful, in a strange and unexpected way, for that particular inheritance. That first night, after the children were finally asleep in the small guest room, Vanessa sat alone on the narrow balcony outside her own room and allowed herself, for the first time, to fully feel the weight of what had happened. She thought about the 9 years of her marriage, replaying them not as a single continuous story, but as a series of small moments, some good, many good in fact, which was perhaps the most painful part of all. She thought about their wedding day, about Daniel crying openly during his vows, about the genuine joy on his face that she had never once doubted was real. She thought about the birth of their children, about Daniel's hands trembling as he held Lily for the first time, about the quiet promises he had whispered to their newborn daughter about protecting her, about being the kind of father who never let his family down. How, she wondered, did a person go from that moment to the one she had overheard the night before? Where exactly along the way had he begun to disappear, to quietly withdraw his heart from their marriage while still going through the motions of staying? She searched her memory for warning signs, for a specific moment she could point to and say, "There, that is when it started, that is when I should have noticed." But there was no single moment. There was only a slow, gradual erosion, so subtle she had convinced herself for years that it was simply the natural texture of a long marriage, the inevitable softening of passion into partnership. She thought, too, about Alina, a woman she had never met and likely never would, a voice she recognized now only from the brief exchange she had overheard, warm and easy in a way that made something ugly twist in Vanessa's stomach. She did not hate Alina, not exactly, though she suspected that hatred might come later, might arrive uninvited in some quiet moment months from now. What she felt in this moment was something closer to a strange, distant pity, imagining a woman who had likely been told the same careful lies Vanessa herself had lived inside for years. A woman who probably believed, just as sincerely as Daniel had once convinced Vanessa to believe things, that she was loved completely and honestly. Morning brought a kind of clarity Vanessa had not expected. She woke before the children, made herself a cup of tea in the guest house's small shared kitchen, and sat at the wooden table with her laptop, beginning the slow, methodical work of building a new life. She contacted a lawyer first, a woman named Grace Whitfield who had been recommended to her years ago by a colleague, and whom Vanessa had saved in her contacts without ever imagining she would actually need to make the call. Grace listened patiently as Vanessa explained the situation, her voice steady even as she described the phone call, the affair, the decision to leave without warning. "You did the right thing," Grace told her, and something in the simple certainty of those words settled a small, trembling part of Vanessa's chest that she had not realized was still seeking permission, still seeking confirmation that she had not overreacted, that her decision to leave in the middle of the night with her children and a single photograph was not some hysterical overreaction, but a reasonable, even necessary response to what she had learned. Grace explained the process ahead of her clearly and without unnecessary alarm. Vanessa would need to formally establish separate residence, which she had already done. She would need to gather financial documentation, which, fortunately, she had been quietly collecting for the better part of a year. Some instinct she had not fully understood at the time telling her to keep careful records of their joint accounts, their property, their shared assets. She would need to decide, eventually, whether she wanted to pursue full separation or attempt some form of reconciliation, though Grace was careful not to push her toward either option, simply laying out the realistic landscape ahead of her. "Take your time," Grace said gently. "You don't have to decide everything today. Right now, focus on keeping your children steady. Everything else can wait." It was, Vanessa realized, exactly the advice she needed to hear. She had spent the previous night imagining an endless cascade of decisions stretching out ahead of her, each one more overwhelming than the last, and Grace's calm, measured guidance reminded her that she did not need to solve everything at once. She needed only to survive this first day, and then the next, building her new life one deliberate step at a time. She spent the following days settling into a careful, protective rhythm. She enrolled Lily in a small local school for what she told her daughter would be a temporary period, though privately Vanessa suspected it might become permanent. She found a part-time position at a design firm in the nearby town, work that used the graphic design skills she had let atrophy over years of focusing primarily on their household and children. Work that reminded her, with each small project she completed, that she was capable of building something entirely her own. Daniel's calls continued, relentless at first, dozens of missed calls piling up on her phone each day, followed by increasingly desperate voicemails that shifted over the course of a week from confused concern to genuine panic to something that sounded, toward the end, almost like anger, as though her silence were somehow an unreasonable overreaction to whatever he imagined might have prompted her departure. Vanessa listened to exactly one of these voicemails, the first one, in which Daniel's voice cracked slightly as he asked where she had gone, whether she and the children were safe, whether something terrible had happened. She listened to the genuine confusion in his voice, the apparent absence of any awareness that his own words, spoken in another woman's apartment, were the reason she had left. And in that confusion, she found her answer confirmed once again. He truly believed, even now, that his secret remained his own, that whatever had prompted her sudden departure was some mystery unrelated to the affair he had been so carefully hiding. She did not listen to any of the subsequent voicemails. She simply let them accumulate, unheard, unanswered, a growing record of a man slowly realizing that something in his carefully constructed life had gone catastrophically wrong, without yet understanding exactly what or why. It was Olivia, Vanessa's older sister, who finally reached her on the fourth day, having heard from Daniel himself, frantic and confused, asking if Olivia knew where his wife and children had disappeared to. Vanessa answered her sister's call immediately, something in her relaxing at the familiar sound of Olivia's voice, steady and warm even through the distance of the phone line. "Tell me everything," Olivia said, and Vanessa did, recounting the accidental phone call in full detail for the first time since it happened, her voice remaining remarkably steady even as she described the exact words she had heard Daniel speak. Olivia listened without interruption, and when Vanessa finally finished, there was a long moment of silence on the line before her sister spoke again. "I am so proud of you," Olivia said quietly. "I know that's probably not what you expected to hear right now, but I am. You didn't scream. You didn't beg him to explain himself. You just left and you're building something better already. That takes a strength most people don't have." Vanessa found herself crying then, for the first time since the night of the phone call, deep, shuddering sobs that she muffled against a pillow so the children would not wake and see her. Olivia stayed on the line the entire time, saying nothing, simply present, the way sisters sometimes know instinctively to be present for each other without needing words to fill every silence. When the tears finally subsided, Vanessa felt something shift inside her, some final piece of her old life settling into place as officially, permanently past. She was no longer the woman who had spent 9 years quietly overlooking small warning signs in her marriage. She was someone new now, someone in the process of becoming, someone who had made a decisive choice in the middle of the night and had not once looked back to question it. Olivia offered to drive down and stay with her for a few days, an offer Vanessa gratefully accepted, and the two sisters spent that weekend together in the small guest house, walking with the children along the coastline, cooking simple meals in the shared kitchen, slowly rebuilding a sense of normalcy that felt entirely different from the normalcy Vanessa had left behind, but no less real, no less valuable. It was during this weekend that Vanessa finally allowed herself to think seriously about the future, not simply the immediate logistics of separation, but the actual shape of the life she wanted to build going forward. She thought about the design work she had begun, small but genuinely satisfying, work that felt entirely her own in a way nothing in her marriage ever fully had. She thought about the small coastal town around her, quieter and simpler than the busy suburb she had left, and found herself, to her own surprise, imagining a permanent life here, imagining Lily and Noah growing up along this coastline, learning to swim in these particular waters, building a childhood entirely separate from the house where their father had once whispered regret into a stranger's ear. She thought, too, though less frequently and with far less clarity, about Daniel himself, about whether he deserved any explanation at all for her disappearance, about whether some part of her still owed him the confrontation she had denied him that first terrible night. Grace had gently reminded her during their most recent call that eventually, through the legal process, Daniel would learn exactly why she had left, that the accidental phone call and its contents would inevitably become part of the official record of their separation. Vanessa found a strange, quiet satisfaction in this fact, the knowledge that he would eventually understand precisely what had ended his marriage, delivered not through her own voice, but through the cold, official language of legal documents, stripped of any opportunity for him to explain himself away or ask for forgiveness she had no intention of offering. By the end of that first week, Vanessa had made her decision, one that felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability she had simply needed time to fully accept. She would not be returning home. Whatever remained of her marriage to Daniel Cole, whatever love had once genuinely existed between them, had ended definitively in the moment she heard him tell another woman that marrying her had been a mistake. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no tearful reconciliation, no lengthy explanation demanded or given. There would only be the quiet, deliberate work of building a new life, one day at a time, in a small coastal town where no one knew her as anything other than exactly who she chose to be from this point forward. She had not yet decided how or when to formally tell Daniel the reason for her departure. Some part of her wanted him to keep guessing a little longer, to sit inside the same uncertain, anxious silence he had unknowingly created for her over months of careful lies. But she knew that eventually, through Grace, through the formal legal process now quietly underway, the truth would reach him in full. And when it did, she intended to be far enough along in building her new life that his reaction, whatever it turned out to be, would no longer have the power to move her at all. By the fifth day, Daniel Cole had stopped pretending to himself that this was some ordinary misunderstanding. He sat in his empty kitchen each morning, staring at a phone that never rang with the voice he needed to hear, and felt something in his chest hollowing out with each passing hour. He had called every hospital within an hour's drive, terrified he might find Vanessa, and the children listed among patients admitted after some terrible accident. He had called the local police station, only to be told, gently but firmly, that a grown woman leaving with her own children was not considered a missing persons case, that he had no legal grounds to demand her location, that whatever had happened between them was, for now, a private matter outside the scope of law enforcement. He had gone, in the span of a single week, from confusion to fear to a slow, dawning suspicion that refused to fully surface no matter how hard he tried to push it down. He kept returning in his mind to that missing photograph, to the calm, deliberate way she must have packed, to the complete absence of chaos or panic in her departure. This had not been a woman fleeing in a moment of impulsive anger. This had been a woman executing a plan, carefully and quietly, and the realization that Vanessa was capable of such calculated resolve frightened him more than he wanted to admit, because it meant she had known exactly what she was doing, and that meant she had known something he did not yet understand. He had not told Alina about Vanessa's disappearance, not at first. Some instinct told him to keep the two halves of his life carefully separated even now, even in crisis, as though maintaining the wall between them might somehow prevent the situation from becoming any more complicated than it already was. But by the 6th day, unable to carry the weight of his fear alone any longer, he finally called her, his voice breaking slightly as he explained that Vanessa and the children had vanished without warning, that he had no idea where they had gone or why. Alina listened quietly on the other end of the line, and Daniel could hear something shift in her silence, something careful and considering that he did not have the emotional clarity, in that moment, to properly interpret as suspicion rather than simple concern. "Did something happen between you two?" Alina finally asked. "Before she left, I mean. Did you two fight?" Daniel told her no, told her that everything had seemed perfectly normal, that he had gone to bed that night with no indication anything was wrong, that Vanessa had given him no warning whatsoever. He believed this completely as he said it, genuinely convinced that his wife's departure was some unexplainable mystery entirely unrelated to anything within his control. He did not think, even for a moment, to connect her sudden disappearance to the quiet, unguarded confession he had made on Alina's couch just hours before Vanessa vanished, because he had no idea, no possible way of knowing, that his phone had betrayed him in the exact moment. He believed himself most completely alone. Alina, for her part, found herself troubled by the conversation in ways she could not fully articulate, even to herself. She had grown accustomed, over the past year, to trusting Daniel's version of events, to accepting his descriptions of a cold, distant marriage without question. But something about the timing of Vanessa's sudden, decisive departure struck her as strange, too calculated to be the impulsive act of a woman simply reacting to an ordinary marital disagreement. Alina found herself, for the first time in their entire relationship, quietly wondering whether Daniel had been entirely honest with her about the true state of his marriage. She did not voice this suspicion aloud, not yet, telling herself it was unfair to add to Daniel's obvious distress with questions she could not yet properly justify. Instead, she offered comfort, told him that Vanessa would likely return once she had cooled down from whatever had upset her, that these situations often resolved themselves given enough time and space. Daniel clung to this reassurance the way a drowning man clings to anything that floats, choosing to believe it because the alternative, some deeper unnamed failure on his own part, felt too frightening to fully consider. It was on the 9th day, nearly 2 weeks after Vanessa's departure, that Daniel finally received the letter from Grace Whitfield's office, delivered by courier to his workplace rather than his home, a detail that struck him immediately as deliberate, as though Vanessa had specifically arranged for him to receive this news somewhere he could not immediately collapse in private. He opened the envelope in his office with trembling hands, his business partner and closest friend, Chris Dalton, watching with visible concern from the doorway. The letter was formal, precisely worded, informing Daniel that Vanessa Cole was initiating separation proceedings and requesting, through her legal counsel, that all future communication be directed through Grace Whitfield's office rather than attempted directly. There was no explanation offered for the separation, no specific accusation laid out in the careful legal language, only the cold, procedural announcement that his marriage was, as far as Vanessa was concerned, definitively and irreversibly over. Daniel read the letter 3 times, searching desperately for some clue, some reason buried within the formal language that might explain what had gone so catastrophically wrong. He found nothing beyond the bare procedural facts. Chris finally stepped fully into the office, gently closing the door behind him, and asked what was happening. "She's leaving me," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. "She's actually leaving me, and I don't even know why." Chris, who had known Daniel for over a decade, who had stood as best man at his wedding to Vanessa, studied his friend's face carefully for a long moment before speaking. "Daniel," he said slowly, "is there something you haven't told me? something that might explain this. Daniel opened his mouth to deny it, the automatic denial rising to his lips out of pure practiced habit. But something in Chris's steady, searching gaze made the denial die before he could fully voice it. He sat down heavily in his office chair, put his face in his hands, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, allowed himself to consider, seriously and honestly, whether his own actions might be the true cause of his wife's sudden, inexplicable departure. "There's someone else," he finally admitted, his voice muffled behind his hands. "It's been going on for a while now, almost a year." Chris did not offer immediate judgment, though something in his expression tightened visibly at the confession. "Does Vanessa know?" he asked carefully. "I don't know how she could," Daniel said, lifting his head, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. I was so careful, she never found anything." There was no evidence, no messages left on shared devices, nothing. But even as he said the words, something cold and uncertain was beginning to stir in the back of his own mind, some faint, half-formed memory tugging at the edges of his awareness. He thought about the night, weeks earlier now, when he had spoken so freely to Alina on her couch, more freely than he usually allowed himself, the wine and the comfortable intimacy of the evening loosening his usual careful discretion. He tried to remember exactly what he had said, whether he had mentioned Vanessa by name, whether anything about that particular conversation had felt different from all the others. He could not fully reconstruct the memory, the specific words lost somewhere in the general haze of that comfortable evening, but a growing, sickening certainty began to settle over him regardless, a feeling that something about that night, something he could not quite grasp, held the answer to everything that had happened since. Chris, watching his friend's face shift through confusion into something approaching genuine dread, asked quietly, "Did you say anything you shouldn't have? Somewhere she might have heard it." Daniel felt his stomach drop entirely. He reached for his phone with shaking hands, scrolling frantically through his call history, back through the days, searching for anything unusual, any call he did not remember making. And there, buried in the log from that particular night, he found it. An outgoing call to Vanessa's number, time-stamped at nearly the exact hour he had been sitting on Alina's couch. A call lasting almost 4 full minutes. A call he had absolutely no memory of making. He stared at the screen, the full horrifying realization crashing over him in a single overwhelming wave. His phone had called her. Somehow, accidentally, impossibly, his phone had called his own wife while he sat confessing his regrets to another woman, and Vanessa, wherever she had been in that moment, had heard every single word. "Oh God," Daniel whispered, the phone slipping from his suddenly numb fingers and clattering onto his desk. "Oh God, she heard everything." Chris said nothing for a long moment, simply watching his friend absorb the full weight of what he had done. The careful architecture of lies he had constructed over the past year collapsing all at once under the simple, devastating truth of an accidental phone call. There was no comfort Chris could offer in that moment, no reassurance that would not feel hollow and false given the reality of what Daniel had actually done. And so he offered only silence, standing quietly beside his friend as Daniel finally, fully understood the true cost of everything he had chosen to hide. For the rest of that day, Daniel sat frozen at his desk, unable to focus on work, unable to think of anything beyond the horrifying clarity that had finally arrived. Every unanswered call over the past 2 weeks now made perfect, terrible sense. Every unread voicemail, the missing photograph, the careful, deliberate way Vanessa had packed and disappeared without leaving so much as a single clue behind. She had not left in confusion or impulsive anger. She had left because she knew, with complete and total certainty, exactly what kind of man she had been married to, and she had chosen, in that single devastating moment, to walk away rather than confront him with an anger he had never truly earned the right to witness. That evening, Daniel finally called Alina again, his voice hollow and shaking as he explained what he had discovered. The accidental call, the 4 minutes during which his wife had listened to him describe his own marriage as a mistake he regretted making. He waited, phone pressed hard against his ear, for some response from Alina, some words of comfort or understanding. What he received instead was a long, heavy silence, followed by a question he had not expected and had no good answer for. "Daniel," Alina said slowly, her voice carefully controlled in a way that frightened him more than anger would have. "How long have you been telling me our situation was more complicated than that? How long have you been saying you were planning to leave her, when the whole time you were still going home every night to a marriage you never actually intended to end?" Daniel opened his mouth to answer, to offer some explanation, some reassurance that would smooth over the growing distance he could feel opening up in Alina's voice. But for the first time in over a year of careful, practiced dishonesty, he found himself with absolutely nothing convincing left to say. The silence between them stretched long enough that Daniel finally spoke again, his voice small and pleading in a way that felt foreign coming from a man who had always carried himself with such easy confidence. "Alina, please, this doesn't change anything between us. If anything, this proves it's finally happening. The marriage is over now, completely, officially. We can finally be together the way we always talked about." Alina sat alone in her apartment, phone pressed to her ear, staring at the wall of photographs she had spent years carefully curating. Images that represented honesty, presence, the kind of full attention she captured in every frame she shot. She thought about all the months she had spent believing Daniel's careful descriptions of a marriage already dead in every way except paperwork, and she felt something cold and clarifying settle over her, a realization she had been avoiding for longer than she wanted to admit. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I need you to answer something honestly, and I need you to actually mean it this time. If your wife hadn't heard that call, if this hadn't happened by accident, would you have ever actually left her? Or would we still be exactly where we've been for the past year, meeting in secret, waiting for some perfect moment that never actually arrives?" Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation, brief as it was, told Alina everything she needed to know. She had asked herself this same question many times over the past months, always pushing the doubt away, always choosing to trust the version of events Daniel presented her. But hearing his silence now, stretched out across the phone line, she finally allowed herself to fully acknowledge what some part of her had suspected for a very long time. "I think I already know the answer," she said softly. "And I think I've known it for a while now. I just didn't want to admit it to myself." "Alina, please don't do this," Daniel said, panic rising clearly in his voice now. "I love you. You know I love you. This is just complicated, that's all. Give me time to sort everything out with Vanessa and then—" "There is no more time to give you, Daniel," Alina interrupted, her voice steadier now than it had been moments before, some final decision crystallizing inside her as she spoke. "I spent a year believing you when you told me your marriage was already over. I believed you when you said you were only waiting for the right moment. But the right moment was never actually going to come, was it? You were always going to keep both of us exactly where it was most convenient for you, for as long as you possibly could." Daniel tried again to explain, to soften what was happening, but Alina found herself no longer listening closely to his words, her attention instead drawn inward, toward the quiet, growing certainty that she needed, finally and completely, to remove herself from a situation that had cost her more than she had ever fully admitted to herself. She thought about the year she had spent making herself available at odd hours, adjusting her own plans around his limited, stolen time, quietly shrinking her own life to fit inside the small spaces he was willing to offer her. "I think you should go," she said finally, cutting through whatever explanation he was still attempting to offer. "Not just off this call. I think you should go completely from my life. I can't keep doing this, Daniel. I deserve better than being someone's convenient secret." "Alina, please," she said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time in the conversation. "Please just let this be over." She ended the call before he could respond further, setting her phone down on the small table beside her couch, the same couch where, weeks earlier, she had listened to him confess his regrets about his marriage without either of them realizing they had an unintended audience. She sat very still for a long time afterward, staring at the wall of photographs surrounding her, images of moments she had captured with complete honesty, and found herself wondering, with a kind of quiet grief, how she had allowed herself to spend an entire year inside a relationship built on the opposite of everything she claimed to value. She thought, too, unexpectedly, about Vanessa, a woman she had never met, whose voice she had only briefly heard in that one accidental exchange overheard through Daniel's own careless retelling of events. She wondered what kind of strength it must have taken to hear such words spoken about your own marriage, and respond not with confrontation or rage, but with quiet, decisive action. She found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, admiring a woman she had spent a year unknowingly wronging. Alina's phone buzzed several more times that evening, Daniel's name appearing again and again on the screen, but she did not answer any of the calls. She had made her decision, and unlike the careful, hesitant choices she had made throughout the entirety of their relationship, this one felt entirely clear, entirely her own, uncomplicated by any lingering hope that things might somehow resolve themselves into something better than what they actually were. She spent the following days slowly, deliberately, removing every trace of Daniel from her life. She deleted his number, blocked his email, returned a small collection of belongings he had left at her apartment over the past year: a jacket, a phone charger, a book he had borrowed and never finished, mailing them to his office without any accompanying note. She threw herself into her photography work with a focused intensity she had not felt in months, accepting every assignment offered to her, filling her calendar and her mind with anything that might help crowd out the persistent, uncomfortable awareness of the role she had played in another family's unraveling. It was during this period of deliberate self-reflection that Alina finally allowed herself to fully process the uncomfortable truth she had been avoiding throughout the entirety of her relationship with Daniel. She had told herself for over a year that his marriage was already effectively over, that she bore no real responsibility for its ending, because it had ended, in every meaningful sense, long before she ever entered the picture. But sitting alone in her apartment now, forced finally to confront the situation without the comfortable filter of Daniel's carefully curated version of events, she understood that she had chosen, consistently and repeatedly, to believe whatever version of the truth was most convenient for her own desires. She had not asked enough questions. She had not pushed hard enough for honesty when small inconsistencies in Daniel's stories occasionally surfaced. She had allowed herself to be persuaded, again and again, because the alternative, walking away from a connection that had genuinely felt meaningful to her, had simply been more painful than continuing to believe comfortable lies. It was not an excuse, she understood now, but it was, at least, an honest accounting of her own complicity in what had happened. 2 weeks after their final phone call, Alina received an unexpected message, not from Daniel, but from an unfamiliar number. She almost did not open it, wary after the persistent stream of increasingly desperate messages Daniel had continued sending despite her repeated silence. But something about the careful, formal tone of the message's preview made her curious enough to read further. The message was from Grace Whitfield, identifying herself as legal counsel representing Vanessa Cole in ongoing separation proceedings, requesting, politely, but firmly, whether Alina would be willing to provide a brief written statement confirming the general nature and timeline of her relationship with Daniel, information that would help establish clear grounds for the separation and ensure a fair, appropriately expedited resolution to the proceedings. Alina stared at the message for a long time, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions she struggled to fully untangle. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protect whatever small remaining privacy she had left regarding an affair she was still working to process and move past. But another part of her, the part that had spent the past 2 weeks reckoning honestly with her own role in this painful situation, felt a quiet pull toward doing something that might actually help Vanessa, a woman who deserved, at minimum, a clean and honest resolution to the marriage she had been so thoroughly deceived within. She replied to Grace Whitfield that evening, agreeing to provide whatever honest information might help, offering a clear, factual timeline of her relationship with Daniel without embellishment or excuse, simply stating what had happened and when. It felt, as she sent the message, like a small but genuine act of accountability, an attempt to offer something honest and useful into a situation she had contributed to making so painfully complicated. She did not know, sending that message, that her simple, honest cooperation would end up playing a small but meaningful role in the final resolution of a marriage she had never intended to help destroy. Nor did she yet fully understand how significantly this entire experience would reshape her own approach to relationships going forward. But sitting alone in her apartment that evening, having finally severed every remaining connection to Daniel Cole, Elena felt, for the first time in over a year, something that closely resembled genuine peace. 3 weeks into her new life, Vanessa found herself standing in the small design studio where she now worked 3 days a week, looking out over the quiet main street of the coastal town that had somehow, gradually, and without her fully noticing the shift, begun to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like an actual home. The studio belonged to a woman named Priya, who had hired Vanessa after seeing a handful of design samples from years earlier, and who had shown remarkable patience as Vanessa slowly rebuilt confidence in skills she had let sit dormant throughout most of her marriage. The work itself was simple at first, small branding projects for local businesses, a new logo for a bakery down the street, updated packaging for a family-owned soap company that had been using the same tired design for over a decade. But Vanessa found genuine satisfaction in each small project, a satisfaction that felt entirely distinct from anything she had experienced in years of managing a household that, she now understood clearly, had never truly needed her the way she had once believed it did. Lily had settled into her new school with the remarkable resilience children often display, making friends quickly, coming home each afternoon full of small stories about classmates and playground games that Vanessa listened to with genuine, grateful attention. Noah, younger and less aware of the larger changes happening around him, seemed content simply to be near his mother and sister, his days filled with the guesthouse garden and the small collection of toys Vanessa had managed to bring with them. Neither child had asked directly about their father in the way Vanessa had feared they might. Lily mentioned him occasionally, wondering aloud when they might see him again, and Vanessa had developed a careful, honest but age-appropriate way of responding, explaining that Mommy and Daddy needed some time apart to figure some things out, that this was not their fault, that both parents loved them very much regardless of where they were currently living. It was not the whole truth, not yet, but it was an honest foundation she could build upon later, when the children were old enough to understand more of the complicated reality behind their parents' separation. Grace Whitfield called that afternoon with an update on the legal proceedings, her voice carrying the same calm, measured tone Vanessa had come to rely on over the past 3 weeks. Daniel's lawyer reached out, Grace said. He's not contesting the separation. He's requesting mediation to work out custody arrangements and asset division rather than pursuing a contested proceeding. Vanessa absorbed this information quietly, feeling less relief than she might have expected. Part of her had braced herself for a fight, for Daniel to deny wrongdoing, to attempt some elaborate defense of his behavior. His decision not to contest felt, in a strange way, like a final small mercy, though she was careful not to mistake it for genuine remorse. She suspected, and Grace's careful phrasing seemed to confirm, that Daniel simply understood he had no realistic grounds to fight the separation given what he now knew about the accidental phone call. He's asked, Grace continued carefully, whether you'd be willing to have a single conversation with him. Not to reconcile, he was clear about that. He said he understands the marriage is over. He simply wants the opportunity to apologize directly, and to discuss arrangements for seeing the children. Vanessa sat with this request for a long moment, turning it over carefully in her mind. She had spent 3 weeks avoiding any direct contact with Daniel, communicating exclusively through Grace's office, and she had found genuine peace in that distance, in not having to hear his voice, not having to watch him search her face for signs of the forgiveness she had no intention of offering. But she understood, too, that eventually, for the sake of her children if nothing else, some level of direct communication with their father would become necessary. "I'll think about it," she told Grace, and Grace, understanding, did not push for an immediate decision. That evening, after the children were asleep, Vanessa sat on the small balcony outside her room, the same spot where she had spent her first devastating night in this new life, and found herself, for the first time, genuinely considering what a conversation with Daniel might accomplish. She was not naive enough to believe it might lead to any real reconciliation, nor did she want it to. Whatever love she had once felt for him had not survived the accidental phone call, had in fact revealed itself, in that single moment, to have already been dying quietly for longer than she had allowed herself to fully acknowledge. But she found herself curious, in a strange, detached way, about what he might actually say, whether he would offer genuine accountability or simply another round of careful excuses. She thought, too, about her children, about Lily's occasional questions, about the eventual necessity of establishing some kind of functional co-parenting arrangement that would allow both children to maintain a relationship with their father despite everything that had happened between their parents. She called Grace back the following morning and agreed to a single conversation, on her own terms, in a public location of her choosing, with clear boundaries established beforehand about what topics were and were not open for discussion. They met 10 days later at a quiet cafe in a town roughly halfway between the coastal community where Vanessa now lived and the suburb where Daniel remained, alone now, in the house they had once shared. Vanessa arrived first, deliberately, wanting the small psychological advantage of already being seated, already composed, when Daniel walked through the door. She watched him approach the table from across the cafe and felt a complicated wash of emotions move through her, none of them quite what she had expected. He looked tired, genuinely tired in a way that went beyond simple physical exhaustion, his usual careful confidence noticeably absent from his posture. He sat down across from her carefully, as though uncertain of his welcome, which, Vanessa reflected, was an entirely accurate assessment of the situation. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said quietly. Vanessa said nothing at first, simply studying his face, searching for whatever remained of the man she had once loved so completely. She found traces of him still there, but altered somehow, as though the past month had worn away some of the easy confidence she remembered, replacing it with something more uncertain, more genuinely humbled. "I'm not here for an apology," she said finally. "I'm here to discuss our children. That's the only reason I agreed to this meeting." Daniel nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he had hoped for more than she was willing to offer. "I understand," he said, "but I need you to know, regardless of whether you want to hear it, that I am genuinely sorry, not just for what you heard that night, but for everything leading up to it. For the entire year I spent lying to you, to Alina, to myself about what I actually wanted." Vanessa listened without visible reaction, though internally, something in her chest tightened at hearing him speak so openly about the full scope of his betrayal. "How long?" she asked, the question escaping before she had fully decided to ask it. "How long were you seeing her before that night?" "Almost a year," Daniel admitted quietly. "It started slowly. I told myself for months it was nothing, just friendship, and then somewhere along the way, it became something I couldn't honestly call nothing anymore." "And in that entire year," Vanessa said, her voice remarkably steady despite the pain moving through her at hearing this timeline confirmed so plainly, "not once did it occur to you to simply be honest with me, to tell me you were unhappy, that you wanted out, that whatever we had built together was no longer enough for you." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands folded on the table between them. "I think," he said slowly, "I was afraid of what it would mean to actually admit that out loud. As long as I didn't say it directly to you, some part of me could keep pretending I hadn't really made the choice yet, that I was still somehow keeping my options open, even though I know now that's not fair to anyone, not to you, not to Alina, not even really to myself." Vanessa absorbed this explanation, finding it neither surprising nor particularly comforting. It was, she recognized, simply an honest accounting of a particular kind of cowardice, the choice to avoid difficult truths for as long as possible rather than face the discomfort of genuine honesty. It did not excuse what he had done, but it did, at least, feel like the first completely truthful thing he had said to her in longer than she wanted to consider. "I'm not interested in relitigating what happened," she said finally. "What's done is done, and nothing you say now changes any of it. What I need from you now is a clear commitment to being present and reliable for Lily and Noah, regardless of whatever happens between us as former spouses. They didn't choose any of this, and they shouldn't have to suffer for choices that were entirely yours to make." "I want that," Daniel said immediately, some genuine urgency entering his voice for the first time in the conversation. "Whatever else happens, I want to be a real presence in their lives. I know I have a lot of rebuilding to do with them and with you in terms of trust. But I'm asking for the chance to try." They spent the following hour discussing practical arrangements, custody schedules, holidays, the logistics of maintaining two households while minimizing disruption to the children's lives. Vanessa found the conversation easier than she had expected, both of them approaching the practical discussion with a kind of business-like focus that allowed them to set aside, at least temporarily, the deeper emotional wreckage still lying beneath the surface of everything they discussed. As the meeting drew to a close, Daniel hesitated before standing, clearly wanting to say something more but uncertain whether it would be welcome. "For what it's worth," he finally said, "I know an apology doesn't undo anything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just needed you to hear directly from me that I understand exactly what I destroyed, and that the fault for all of it rests entirely with me." Vanessa studied him for a long moment before responding. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally, her voice carrying no warmth but also no particular anger, simply a kind of tired, settled honesty. "But understand something clearly. This isn't the beginning of us finding our way back to each other. This is the end, fully and completely. What we're building now is simply a working relationship focused entirely on our children. Nothing more than that will ever exist between us again." Daniel nodded slowly, accepting this without argument, and Vanessa found herself, watching him finally walk out of the cafe alone, feeling something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not lingering anger, but simply a quiet, settled sense of closure, the final necessary conversation completed, allowing her to fully turn her attention toward the new life she was building, one deliberate step at a time, in the small coastal town that increasingly felt less like a refuge and more like exactly where she was always meant to be. 2 months after the accidental phone call that had ended his marriage, Daniel Cole sat alone in his half-empty house, surrounded by boxes he had not yet found the energy to unpack from a move he had made only weeks earlier, downsizing from the family home to a smaller apartment closer to his office. A practical decision made necessary by the terms of the separation agreement he and Vanessa had finally settled through mediation. The house they had shared for nearly a decade now belonged legally to Vanessa, a decision Daniel had not fought, understanding on some deep level that it was the least he could offer given everything else he had taken from her. He had kept some furniture, a few boxes of books, his clothes and personal belongings, but the vast majority of the life they had built together remained behind in that house, now slowly being reshaped by Vanessa into something entirely her own, according to updates he occasionally received through Grace's office regarding scheduling for his time with the children. His relationship with Alina had ended completely and permanently, exactly as she had promised during their final phone call. He had reached out several more times in the weeks following that conversation, sending messages he now recognized, looking back, as increasingly desperate and self-serving, more focused on his own loneliness than any genuine concern for how she was managing the fallout of their relationship. She had never responded to any of them, and eventually, painfully, he had accepted that this particular chapter of his life was fully and irreversibly closed. He thought about her sometimes, late at night in his sparsely furnished apartment, wondering how she was doing, whether she had found the honest, uncomplicated relationship she deserved, the kind he had never actually been capable of offering her despite all his promises. He hoped, in his more honest moments, that she had moved forward successfully, that his own failures had not left permanent damage on her ability to trust future partners. His relationship with his own children remained the one area of his life where he found himself trying, genuinely and consistently, to rebuild something worth preserving. He had Lily and Noah every other weekend, driving the 2 hours to the coastal town where they now lived with Vanessa, picking them up from the small guest house that had, according to Lily's cheerful updates, recently transitioned into an actual small rental house Vanessa had found nearby, complete with a proper bedroom for each of them and a small yard where Noah had started collecting rocks he found particularly interesting. These weekend visits were, at first, awkward and strained, the children uncertain how to navigate spending extended time with a father who now lived somewhere entirely separate from their daily lives. Daniel found himself, during these early visits, working harder than he ever had at anything, learning to be genuinely present in ways his old life, filled with work obligations and secret meetings with Alina, had never actually required of him. He learned Lily's current favorite books, the ones she wanted read aloud at bedtime during their weekends together. He learned Noah's particular fascination with insects, spending an entire Saturday afternoon on his hands and knees in a public park helping his son search for beetles and worms, an activity that would have felt, in his old life, like an inconvenient distraction from more important work, but which now felt like some of the only genuinely meaningful time he spent all week. Slowly, gradually, the children began to relax around him again, Lily's initial reserve softening into something closer to her old easy affection, Noah beginning to ask, unprompted, when his next visit with Daddy would be. Daniel found himself, watching this slow rebuilding of trust, more grateful than he had words to properly express, understanding clearly that this particular relationship, unlike his marriage, still held genuine possibility for repair, provided he continued showing up, consistently, and honestly, in the way he had so thoroughly failed to do throughout much of his marriage. His conversations with Vanessa, handled almost entirely through brief, businesslike text messages regarding logistics and scheduling, remained cordial but carefully distant, exactly as she had promised during their cafe meeting. There was no warmth in these exchanges, no lingering hope of reconciliation, simply the practical, necessary communication required of two parents committed to raising their children well despite no longer sharing a life together. Daniel had, in the 2 months since everything fell apart, spent considerable time reflecting honestly on the choices that had led him to this point. Choices he had spent over a year carefully justifying to himself through a series of small, comfortable lies. He understood now, with a clarity that had been entirely absent during the actual affair, that his unhappiness in his marriage, whatever genuine roots it might have had never actually required deceiving two different women simultaneously in order to address it. He could have been honest with Vanessa from the beginning, could have pursued marriage counseling, could have made the difficult but respectable choice to end the marriage cleanly before ever becoming involved with Alina. Instead, he had chosen the easier, more cowardly path, maintaining the comfortable stability of his marriage while simultaneously pursuing the excitement and validation he found with Alina, refusing to make any genuine choice at all, hoping instead to somehow preserve both relationships indefinitely through careful compartmentalization and calculated dishonesty. It was, he now understood, an approach doomed from the very beginning to eventual, painful collapse, and he had no one to blame for that collapse except himself. His business partner, Chris, remained one of the few people who had stayed consistently present throughout this difficult period, offering neither excessive judgment nor easy forgiveness, simply steady, honest friendship that Daniel found himself deeply grateful for. It was during one of their regular lunches, roughly 10 weeks after everything had fallen apart, that Chris finally asked the question Daniel had been avoiding asking himself. "Do you think you've actually changed?" Chris asked directly. "Or are you just going through the motions of regret because you got caught?" Daniel considered the question seriously before answering, understanding that Chris deserved an honest response rather than a defensive one. "I think," he said slowly, "for a long time, I genuinely didn't understand what I was doing to the people around me. I was so focused on my own unhappiness that I convinced myself my choices were somehow justified, that I was simply pursuing my own happiness in a situation that had become unbearable. It took losing everything to actually understand how selfish that thinking really was." "And now," Chris pressed, "now I understand that real happiness was never actually going to come from lying to two different people simultaneously," Daniel said. "If I was unhappy in my marriage, the honest thing would have been to address that directly, painful as that conversation might have been. Instead, I chose the coward's path, and I ended up losing far more than I ever would have lost by simply being honest from the beginning." Chris nodded slowly, seeming to accept this answer as genuine. "Your kids seem happier lately," he offered. "Lily was telling my daughter at that birthday party last weekend about some rock collection her brother's been building. She seemed proud of it, proud of you for helping him with it." Something in Daniel's chest tightened at hearing this, a small but genuine flicker of hope that perhaps, despite everything he had broken, something worth preserving could still be built from the wreckage of his choices. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "It's the one thing I actually have left worth fighting for." That evening, alone again in his sparsely furnished apartment, Daniel found himself thinking about the accidental phone call that had started this entire painful chain of events. The 4 minutes during which his careless words had reached the one person they were never intended to reach. He had spent considerable time, in the immediate aftermath, cursing his own bad luck, the cruel randomness of a pocket dial that had exposed everything he had worked so hard to keep hidden. But sitting alone now, 2 months removed from that devastating night, he found himself viewing the accidental call differently. It had not created the problems in his marriage or his choices. It had simply, finally, forced an honest reckoning that he himself had never possessed the courage to initiate. Vanessa deserved to know the truth about her marriage, deserved the opportunity to build a life free from his ongoing deception. And if he was ever going to become the kind of honest, present father his children deserved, that transformation had likely required exactly this kind of devastating, unavoidable exposure. It did not undo the pain he had caused, did not excuse the year of careful lies he had told to 2 different women who had each deserved far better from him. But it had, in its own painful way, finally forced him toward a kind of honesty he had spent years actively avoiding. And for that, strange as it felt to admit, he found himself genuinely, quietly grateful. 6 months after the night everything changed, Vanessa stood in the small backyard of the rental house she now called home, watching Lily and Noah chase each other across the grass in the fading light of a warm evening, their laughter carrying easily across the quiet neighborhood. The house was modest compared to the one she had left behind, but it was entirely hers, filled with furniture she had chosen herself, walls painted colors she genuinely loved rather than colors selected to please someone else's preferences. Her work at Priya's design studio had expanded steadily over the months, her client list growing through word-of-mouth recommendations, as local businesses discovered her genuine talent for creating clean, memorable branding. Priya had recently offered her a full partnership in the studio, an offer Vanessa was seriously considering, drawn to the possibility of building something entirely her own, after years of measuring her worth primarily through her role within her marriage. She had made friends in the coastal community, genuine friendships built on honesty rather than the careful social performances she had grown accustomed to within her old social circle. She had joined a small group of women who met weekly for dinner, several of them. She had learned over time, also navigating their own experiences with divorce or separation, and she found genuine comfort in these conversations, in discovering she was not alone in rebuilding a life after discovering a partner's betrayal. Her relationship with Daniel remained exactly what she had established during their cafe meeting months earlier, cordial, businesslike, entirely focused on their children's well-being. He arrived punctually for his scheduled weekends, always prepared, always genuinely engaged with Lily and Noah in ways that, Vanessa had to honestly admit, seemed to have deepened significantly since the separation. She found herself, watching him interact with their children during pickups and drop-offs, genuinely pleased that he was showing up as the father their children deserved, even as she remained completely certain that whatever remained of her own feelings toward him as a romantic partner had permanently and irreversibly died. She thought occasionally about the accidental phone call that had ended her marriage, though these thoughts came less frequently now, and with far less emotional intensity than they had in those first devastating weeks. She had, with the help of a therapist she had begun seeing shortly after settling into her new life, worked through much of the anger and grief that had initially accompanied the discovery of Daniel's betrayal, arriving eventually at a place of genuine, hard-won peace. She did not regret leaving in the way she had, quickly and quietly, without confrontation, in the middle of the night. Some people, she knew, might have expected her to fight for her marriage, to demand explanations, to at least attempt some form of reconciliation before making such a decisive, permanent choice. But Vanessa had come to understand, through months of reflection, that her swift, silent departure had actually been an act of profound self-respect, a recognition that she deserved better than to beg for honesty from someone who had spent an entire year choosing deception instead. On a quiet Tuesday evening, roughly 7 months after that devastating night, Vanessa received an unexpected message from Alina Brooks, a woman she had never met but whose voice, briefly overheard through an accidental phone call, had become an unavoidable part of the story of her marriage's ending. The message was brief but sincere, expressing genuine remorse for whatever pain Alina's involvement had contributed to Vanessa's life, and offering, without any expectation of response, a simple acknowledgement that Vanessa deserved far better than the betrayal she had experienced. Vanessa sat with the message for a long time before responding, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions she had not fully anticipated. She had spent months occasionally imagining this other woman, sometimes with anger, sometimes with something closer to pity, understanding on some level that Alina had likely been deceived about the true state of Vanessa's marriage in her own way. Reading this genuine, unprompted apology, Vanessa found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, feeling something close to closure regarding this final piece of the story. She replied simply, thanking Alina for reaching out, acknowledging that she appreciated the honesty of the gesture, and wishing her genuine well in whatever came next. She did not offer forgiveness exactly, understanding that forgiveness, if it ever came at all, would need to develop slowly and naturally rather than being rushed through a single exchange of messages. But she offered something adjacent to forgiveness, a genuine acknowledgement that both of them had been, in their own different ways, wronged by the same man's careful, calculated dishonesty. As autumn settled over the coastal town, bringing cooler evenings and the first signs of changing leaves along the quiet streets, Vanessa found herself increasingly confident in the life she had built from the wreckage of that single devastating night. She had accepted Priya's partnership offer, formally becoming co-owner of the small design studio that had given her back a sense of professional purpose she had not realized how much she missed. Lily had settled fully into her new school, thriving both academically and socially, her initial anxiety about the move having long since transformed into genuine affection for her new community. Noah's rock collection had grown into an elaborate, carefully organized display along his bedroom windowsill, each specimen labeled with information he had researched himself, a hobby Daniel had continued nurturing during their weekend visits together. One evening, sitting on the small back porch of her rental house after the children had finally settled into sleep, Vanessa found herself reflecting on the strange, unexpected journey of the past 7 months. She thought about the woman she had been on that terrible night, standing frozen in her kitchen, phone pressed against her ear, listening to her husband's careless confession travel across an accidental connection neither of them had intended. She thought about the woman she had become since then, steady, capable, genuinely happy in ways she had not realized, until they returned, how long she had been missing from her own life. She did not believe, looking back honestly on those months, that she owed Daniel any gratitude for what had happened. His betrayal had been real, his choices had been entirely his own, and the pain he had caused her and their children had been genuine and significant. But she found herself, sitting quietly on her porch as the evening settled into full darkness around her, grateful nonetheless for the strange, unexpected clarity that single accidental phone call had provided. Without it, she understood, she might have continued for years inside a marriage slowly hollowing itself out beneath the surface, never fully knowing the truth, never given the opportunity to choose, decisively and completely, a different and ultimately better path forward. The accidental call had been devastating in the moment, had shattered every assumption she held about her marriage and her future. But it had also, in its own painful way, set her free, forcing an honest reckoning that allowed her to build something entirely new, entirely her own, out of the wreckage of a life that had never actually been as solid as she had once believed. Lily wandered out onto the porch just then, unable to sleep, climbing quietly into her mother's lap despite being nearly too big now for such closeness. Vanessa wrapped her arms around her daughter, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, and looked out over the quiet street where fireflies had begun appearing in the deepening dusk. "Are you happy here, Mom?" Lily asked quietly, her voice carrying the particular directness that only children seem capable of. Vanessa considered the question seriously before answering, wanting to offer her daughter something genuinely true rather than simply comforting. "Yes," she said finally, and found, saying the word aloud, that she meant it completely. "I think, for the first time in a very long time, I actually am." She held her daughter close as the evening deepened around them, thinking of the long road that had brought her to this particular porch, this particular life, built entirely from her own choices rather than the careful compromises of a marriage that had, in the end, never truly seen her at all. Somewhere 2 hours away, Daniel was likely settling into his own quiet evening, building slowly toward whatever redemption remained possible for him, while here, in this small coastal town she had chosen for herself, Vanessa had found something far more valuable than the life she had lost. A genuine, hard-won understanding of exactly who she was capable of becoming, once given the freedom, however painfully arrived at, to finally choose for herself. A full year had passed since the night Vanessa first heard her husband's voice traveling through an accidental phone connection, and on a bright spring morning, she found herself standing outside the small design studio she now co-owned, hanging a new sign above the door that read the studio's expanded name, a name that now included her own alongside Priya's, a small but meaningful symbol of everything she had rebuilt from nothing. The business had grown steadily throughout the year, their client list expanding well beyond the small local shops that had first given Vanessa her start, now including regional companies seeking the kind of thoughtful, honest branding work that had become the studio's particular reputation. Vanessa had discovered, throughout this process, a genuine talent for leadership she had never had the opportunity to develop during her years, focused primarily on managing a household, and she found herself, increasingly, mentoring younger designers who came through the studio seeking guidance. Lily, now 8, had grown into a confident, articulate child, thriving in her school and recently developing a passionate interest in marine biology after a class field trip to a nearby aquarium, spending hours researching different species of coastal wildlife with the same careful curiosity she seemed to have inherited from both of her parents. Noah, 6 now, had expanded his rock collection into a broader fascination with earth science generally, his bedroom now containing an elaborate collection of specimens organized according to a system he had developed himself, each one carefully labeled and cataloged. Daniel continued his regular weekend visits, and over the course of the year, something had genuinely shifted in his relationship with the children, a consistency and presence that Vanessa, despite everything, found herself respecting even as her own feelings toward him as a former partner remained permanently settled into distant, business-like cordiality. He had begun, several months earlier, dating someone new, a woman named Grace, no relation to Vanessa's lawyer, whom he had met through a mutual friend, and who, according to careful, indirect updates Vanessa occasionally received through the children's casual mentions, seemed to genuinely value the kind of honesty Daniel had claimed throughout their entire marriage to find so difficult to offer. Vanessa found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely hoping this new relationship succeeded, understanding that a happier, more settled Daniel would likely translate into a more stable, consistent presence for their children. She had released, sometime during the past year, whatever lingering anger she had once carried, not because his betrayal had become any less real or significant, but because she had come to understand that carrying that anger indefinitely served no purpose beyond weighing down the genuinely good life she had built for herself. She had herself begun cautiously dating again roughly 8 months after settling into her new community, meeting a man named Julian through mutual friends at one of her regular weekly dinners. Julian was a marine conservation researcher who worked at the local university, a patient, thoughtful man who had never once made her feel rushed or pressured as she slowly, carefully rebuilt her capacity to trust another partner. Their relationship remained new, still developing slowly and deliberately, but Vanessa found in it something she had not experienced in her marriage for many years before its ending: genuine, uncomplicated honesty, a partner who told her clearly and directly what he was thinking and feeling rather than hiding behind careful evasions. Elena Brooks, meanwhile, had also continued rebuilding her own life in the aftermath of everything that had happened. She had thrown herself fully into her photography career throughout the year, eventually landing a significant gallery exhibition showcasing a series of honest, unguarded portraits she had taken of women navigating major life transitions, a project she had begun, she later explained in an interview about the exhibition, as a way of processing her own experience of learning to trust her own judgment again after a relationship built on someone else's careful deceptions. She and Vanessa had exchanged a small handful of additional messages over the year, nothing approaching genuine friendship, but a kind of quiet, respectful acknowledgement between two women who understood, in ways few others could fully appreciate, exactly what the other had experienced at Daniel's hands. It was not closure exactly, but it was something adjacent to it, a mutual recognition that healing sometimes required extending grace even toward people whose choices had once caused genuine pain. On the anniversary of that devastating night, Vanessa found herself, somewhat unexpectedly, not dwelling in grief or lingering anger, but instead reflecting with genuine gratitude on everything the past year had taught her about her own resilience and capability. She had driven, that particular evening, to a quiet stretch of coastline not far from her home, watching the sunset paint the sky in deep oranges and purples over the water, and found herself thinking not about what she had lost, but about everything she had discovered about herself in the process of rebuilding. She had learned that she was capable of far more strength and clarity than she had ever given herself credit for during her marriage, when so much of her identity had been quietly subsumed into the role of supportive wife and mother, important work certainly, but work that had gradually crowded out her own individual sense of purpose and capability. She had learned that leaving, even suddenly and without explanation, could be an act of profound self-respect rather than cowardice or overreaction. She had learned that her children, given honest, consistent love from both parents even in separate households, could not only survive but genuinely thrive through significant family change. Perhaps most importantly, she had learned that the version of herself she had glimpsed in flashes throughout her marriage, capable, creative, professionally ambitious, had never actually disappeared, had simply been waiting patiently for the opportunity to fully emerge once again. The accidental phone call that had shattered her old life had, in its own painful, unexpected way, provided exactly that opportunity, forcing a reckoning she might never have chosen for herself, but which had ultimately led her toward a life far more genuinely her own than anything she had built during 9 years of careful, quiet compromise. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the water in soft silver light, Vanessa allowed herself a final, deliberate moment of reflection on everything the past year had brought her, before turning back toward her car, toward the small house waiting for her with her children inside, toward the design studio that bore her own name now alongside her business partners, toward the careful, patient new relationship still slowly developing with a man who had shown her, consistently, exactly the kind of honesty she deserved. She thought, one final time, about the moment that had started this entire unexpected journey, standing alone in her old kitchen at midnight, phone pressed against her ear, listening to words that had shattered every assumption she held about her own life. She did not wish that moment away, did not imagine some alternate version of events where she had never overheard that fateful, accidental call. Instead, she found herself genuinely thankful for the clarity it had ultimately provided, however devastating the delivery had been. Some doors, she had come to understand, needed to close completely and permanently before entirely new ones could finally open. Her marriage had been one such door, closed not through her own choice initially, but through circumstances entirely beyond her control, a careless pocket dial that had exposed a truth she deserved to know. But everything that had opened for her afterward, the career she had rebuilt, the community she had found, the deeper, more authentic relationship with her own children, the new possibility of genuine partnership with someone who valued honesty as much as she did, all of it had been built through her own deliberate choices, her own quiet strength, her own unwavering commitment to building a life worth living regardless of how devastatingly it had once appeared to fall apart. She drove home slowly along the coastal road, windows down, the evening air carrying the familiar scent of salt water and approaching spring, and found herself smiling, genuinely and without reservation at the life stretching out ahead of her, uncertain in the way all genuine futures remain uncertain, but built, finally and completely, entirely on her own terms.